about this process that we've developed over the years in working with communities that we call community learning through data-driven discovery. It sort of fell out of the work that we were doing with Mike Lambert and some cooperative extension folks, but also other communities that we worked with. And then it was a process that we brought to Cass in Iowa to let her try out and see how it would work. And it seemed to be pretty effective. And you'll see one of those examples with Marshalltown in just a minute. But it's really more to get you familiar with this process, because this is the process you will be using.
Oh no, did you spoil the whole thing?
Pardon me?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I wasn't on mute.
Oh, okay. So this is a process that you will be using, you know, as you're working with the different communities in the community-based research in many of the projects this summer. So, you know, as you have questions as we go along, please ask them. If you're confused about something, please ask. If you have some interesting insight or thought, please share. So, everybody good with that? I see Mike's head nodding, that's it. Yes, yes, okay, I'm going forward then. If I can figure out how to change my slide. There we go. So I also wanted to just take a moment to share with you how this focus on economic mobility entered into this year's Data Science for the Public Good Young Scholars Program. So we started off by landing a wonderful grant from USDA. And the grant that we landed from USDA was to have UVA work with Iowa State, Virginia Tech, Virginia State, and Oregon State to launch Data Science for the Public Good Young Scholars programs, similar to the program that we had established over several years. So that was great, and we were rolling forward to work with these different programs. And central to that particular grant was this idea that the projects that the teams would work in these different universities would bubble up from issues and relationships that the cooperative extension professionals across our states had in different rural communities in the state, in each one of the 3 states. And so many of your projects this summer have a cooperative extension professional that you're working with, in addition to a local stakeholder or some other organization. So that was the genesis of launching these programs and the funding that we have from USDA that's supporting these programs and supporting all of you. Well, then the other thing that happened is shortly after we were successful there, we started talking to the Gates Foundation. And we learned that the Gates Foundation was really interested in trying to identify if there are existing networks across the country that could be leveraged to help advance economic mobility. And here, economic mobility, we're taking a very broad definition of it. So as we started talking to them, we shared with them the cooperative extension system, and some of the folks at Gates that we were talking with, they'd heard of this network, but they weren't very familiar with it. And so we encouraged them to fund us to do a pilot over a 12-month period, which we're in the middle of right now, where we would work in our 3 states. We'd marry this up with the USDA funding, and we would work within our 3 states to engage with cooperative extension around economic mobility, and to see if they could actually function as a great network to help advance economic mobility, to understand it, to take a data-driven approach to understanding their communities and the various issues in their communities around economic mobility. One thing that's really important to note is that the Gates Foundation, when they think about economic mobility, or at least in the past when they have thought about economic mobility, they have thought about it from the perspective of the individual. How do I help the individual raise them out of poverty is a great example. And what we shared with them, what we wanted to do was to take a different look at economic mobility. We wanted it to be economic mobility of a community, and looking at how do we raise a community and advance a community in its support of economic mobility. So it's a subtle difference, and it's a difference that we'll be talking about a lot throughout the summer. The overall goal of putting these things together is to, first of all, we're leveraging all of you in the program this summer to be able to actually execute different projects around economic mobility and other things. But this economic mobility is the cooperative extension focus, and we're leveraging and pulling these two things together. Our overall goal is to really help evolve the next generation of cooperative extension that can take data-driven approaches to better understand their communities. So that's sort of the backdrop that is related to the community-specific data science for the public good work. So let me pause there. Does anybody have a question?
No questions on chat so far.
Okay.
But anyone, feel free to do it or to raise your hand using the participant. On the bottom of your screen, there's a little participant bar. You can click it, and within there, you can choose to raise your hand or have some other reaction. So please feel free to raise your hand, and we will call on you as we go along.
All right, moving forward. So here it is, the great process that we're very excited about. And again, we call this community learning through data-driven discovery. CLD3 is the acronym. And the picture here on the right is showing you what the process looks like. And what the picture doesn't show, and partly because we're not so agile yet to animate this picture, happy if anybody wants to take that on, but it's a very dynamic process. And in the examples we're going to share with you, you'll see how dynamic it is. And it will hopefully help set the stage as you have these engagements. But when you look at this picture, you have this outside ring that's the light gray. We like to think of that outside wheel as the sort of continuous communication and interaction with all of the partners that are involved in the particular problem in the particular community. So you always start the process by engaging community stakeholders to identify their issues. So in this process, we don't go in telling a community, oh, you've got problems with obesity, let's go look at that. No. We go with a community, we elicit from the communities, what are the issues and problems that are keeping them up at night, that could benefit from some data insights to help understand and learn about those so they could ultimately figure out what actions that they can take, how they could apply resources that they have, all these different sorts of things. And so as the process, kind of moves around, and it's a continuous learning process, you have more communication occurring at every single stage, whether it's with subject matter experts, which frequently come from the community or from cooperative extension professionals, and their reach back to our universities for expertise. And ultimately you share learnings that are going to drive change. So all of this outside wheel is this continuous communication across stakeholders. And again, all of you are part of the stakeholders now. You're part of the stakeholders, you're part of the partners, some of you are subject matter experts. So you're all part of this partnership with this community. So the middle wheel here is what we like to think about as the data-driven learning process. And this is where we come in pretty strongly through data discovery, and you're going to learn a lot more about that today, through the different statistical and mathematical techniques we use to integrate data. The actions that are chosen are really coming through discussions and really coming from the community stakeholders versus the data scientists. Communities need to decide what their actions are. But then once actions are taken, again, looking for data-driven ways to measure and evaluate the impact of those actions. If they develop a new program, let's say they launch a new 4-H program, well, how are we going to measure and evaluate the impact of that program? Or there could be a new policy change. And then based on this measuring and evaluation, there may be decisions that the community makes to redirect resources. And then, or maybe it's a redefinition of that issue or problem that they presented to begin with. And then the And then the process continues. And you cycling back through, you're learning more. So that's where there's this continuous learning process. I like to think of this little white line here as a frontier between the outer wheel and the middle wheel. That, again, that's an important frontier because that's where communication is happening between, the data teams and the communities, the cooperative extension professionals and the communities. That frontier is a frontier of communication between all the partners. And then this inner circle, this is where the rigorous data science theory and methods and process lives. And it ties it all together. We're not just doing this whimsically. There is a fundamental data science framework and process that we use, that you're learning, that forms the core of all of the data-driven actions. So before I move on, let me pause again. Are there any questions?
No questions in chat as yet.
Is everybody bored? Well, nobody has their camera on. How would I know? No, okay, thank you guys. I need a little reaction here. Otherwise, I'm talking to my Great Dane, who's very attentive.
There's a raised hand in the chat from Vatsala Ramanan. Vatsala, I'm going to unmute you. So you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that. I just wanted to know if you'd have an example of the impact that a previous project might have had and like how that has been measured in the past.
We do, and that's coming up in the examples.
Thank you so much.
And it's fair to say that most of our work over the last couple of years have wandered around the wheels through actions being derived. But we do have, one great example where they've actually done some measuring and evaluation. This all takes time. On all of your projects this summer, you might enter these wheels at different points, although I think most of them are entering here. Cass, that may not be true for some of the Iowa State projects. But anyway, you can, projects can enter the wheel at different points and then continue to move forward. All right, so let me continue. And the next thing is to remind you, or to let it appear again, at least the second time this week. Here's the data science framework. And remember, that sits at that heart of the process. It's the really important research framework that we exercise when we're doing data science. One of the articles that we asked you to read was the Harvard Data Science Review article about doing data science. And that article, through a case study with Fairfax County, walked you through the framework. This framework, these arrows that are in here are important. The framework looks like a linear thing, but it's far from linear. There's interaction and back and forth throughout time and throughout the framework. But the important thing about this framework and about how we approach data science is that it always starts with the problem. It starts with the identification of a problem. What is the issue that we're going to try to work on? How do we frame that issue in a data context? What are the questions and working hypotheses we want to try to bring to light? What does the literature say about this problem, both the peer-reviewed literature and the gray literature? What is it, who else has had this issue? Who else has tried to come to grips with ways to look at this issue? And then it works down into what data sources are going to be useful here. You're going to spend time this afternoon learning about data discovery, then ultimately the acquisition of the data and bringing it into our system and making sure that we have the right governance and control over that. Sometimes data that we have is confidential information or data that needs to have privacy protections on it. All that has to be built into the process. You'll learn more about that throughout the course of the summer in terms of how we approach these different topics. And then, of course, your favorite is the wrangling of the data. You'll spend 80% of your time here in terms of taking all of this data that already exists out there, and figuring out how you're going to repurpose it to bring it to bear on the problem at hand, and to make sure that that data is is appropriate, is clean, is accurate. So that's where you'll learn a lot of tricks of the trade here this summer, but that's where in all of your research in data science going forward is where you will spend a lot of time, and it's critically important. Tied together with this is trying to understand which data is actually fit for use. If I'm repurposing administrative data to try to understand my issue, I need to determine whether or not it's really useful for that. And then your modeling and analysis and communication and dissemination, there's your outside ring of the wheel. And ethics, which is critically important, and it attaches to every part of this process. Because if we're using data that we haven't statistically designed for the particular problem at hand, if we're using, say we're using administrative data, we're using, as an example, in the Fairfax case, we were using the 6th, 8th, and 10th grade student surveys about their behaviors. And so if we're using those data sources and we're trying to integrate those data sources to get a handle on physical activity and possible pointers to obesity, well, what are the ethical implications of doing that? And how useful and how well does that data work for that purpose? And in that article, you noted that some of it didn't work very well. And it's really important to know that and not just barrel forward as if this data is perfect for this problem. And all of this has to be documented. This framework creates the scaffolding for documenting every step of the data science process and activity. So someone else could understand what you've done. Someone else could replicate your work and reproduce your work. And that's all very, very important. Okay, before we jump to the examples, let me pause again.
Yeah, there's a question in chat, and this comes from Chase Dawson. The question is, what is the process for long-term project maintenance? This may be less important with some data science projects that result in a one-time report, but for projects with continuous streams of data or any other continuous aspect, does SDET follow up on closed projects?
So let me unpack that a little bit. So, so long-term project maintenance, some of what you've learned about how we're handling and doing documentation on Git, for example, is one way where we have a way to archive and, and have repositories of the documentation of the data, of all aspects of a project. So that's one way that sort of this long-term project maintenance can occur, because you're documenting everything as you go and you're putting it in a place that you're going to be able to go back to and access. So that's one answer to the question. And then another answer to the other part of the question, how have we, what have we done to follow up on closed projects? That's a great question. Again, through the way that we archive and our repositories of information can allow us to go back to that project and understand what we did at the time. And it's not uncommon for us to do work in a particular project and with a particular community. And then it kind of goes quiet for a year or so. And then all of a sudden it comes back again. And our work with the Arlington County Police Department and our work with the Arlington County Fire Department are great examples of that. And so we want to go back to be able to pick up where we left off. And we also want to be able to replicate what we did at that time. Maybe we would do a different model today, but we want to at least be able to go back and understand why we did what we did at the time we did it. And I don't know if Aaron, if you have anything you'd like to add to that.
No, I think that about covers it. As long as we're doing our job and make sure, others can pick up where we left off. It's not always going to be us. It's going to be, and that's what we want to enable. That's why we try and do everything open source and everything in a format that can be reused.
Right. And then I see there's a question about, is there any effort to train community partners and better data collection practices to improve data reliability in the long run and to minimize the amount of data wrangling that needs to be done? I don't think you ever get to minimize the amount of data wrangling. Let me just put that out there. But in terms of trying to help community partners do better data collection practices. So this whole process, the whole community learning through data-driven discovery process is driving right towards that we're trying to help communities, we're trying to help our cooperative extension professional colleagues first understand the value of data insights. You will be very surprised how new this is to many people. So that first they have to understand that data insights are valuable. And as soon as they begin to understand that data insights are valuable, then they actually get quite hungry for more data, and even more data that's right within their own programs and collection that they can do. And then their data collection practices improve. We saw that, again, I don't mean to keep using the fire department as fire EMS department as an example, but it just is a good example because it had so many components of this. When we started working with them, so much of their records where they had to write things in were really, really bad. And it's because nobody ever used that data. There was no reason, they had no incentive to actually do accurate reporting after an incident was already done and after they'd done the required reporting. But bits of information that were incredibly valuable for the analysis was in that last piece. And when they began to see how their data might be used and how it would be valuable to them, all of a sudden their reporting improved. So it's a back and forth process that we have here. Okay, did that answer the question? Think so?
Yeah, and there's one other one from Kyle that you might see, or would you like me to
so
read it?
is economic mobility a way to build generational wealth? If so, how can we make sure future generations continue to build wealth? Well, building wealth is one aspect of economic mobility, and this is a topic that Cass actually likes to talk about from time to time. Cass, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, and this is part of your question gets at the heart of, are we talking about individuals or are we talking about communities? And are we talking about community wealth or individual wealth, or you know, our daily income, what it takes to make things work today, and what we can kind of pass on to future generations. And we're actually, I want to flip this question a little bit and say, we're trying to get everyone to think about this really from a community standpoint, and not just our scholars, but Gates as well. This was something that we pushed back on. You know, Sallie mentioned this. We went back and forth quite a bit to say, we understand that economic mobility is usually talking about an individual, not just wealth, but wealth accrual is really crucial at an individual level for maintaining that, that change in socioeconomic status over time. But at the community level, we like to think about these things in the framework that we're starting to really work with is the community capitals. And so this goes way beyond wealth. You know, what are the many variety, very wonderful assets that communities have that might be built assets, the resources they have, the museums that you can go to, the shops, the different things like that. They might also, and broadband, but it might be things like, is it a beautiful place that people like to visit? You know, what is the human capital? What is the educational resources? What is the financial capital? So we have 7 different capitals, and we want to think about how are we building assets across all of these capitals that can inspire growth and provide more resources for people in that community over time. And one of those assets is exactly what Sallie's talking about right here. It's data. These communities have data that is an untapped resource for them that they're not using in many instances because they either don't have the human resources to get it done, or they don't have the technical resources to get it done. And so part of what we're going in is trying to uncover some of these hidden assets that will help develop and grow their community assets overall and help position them for more growth in the future. So I would say it's beyond wealth, but wealth is certainly a big part of the story.
Thank you, Cass. Okay, so we have 3 examples we're going to walk through. And the first one, actually, Cass is going to do.
Yeah, oh, I'll put my camera on.
Tell me, okay. Tell me when you want to change the slide.
Okay. So the first one is in Giles County. And this is a really great example because it gets to the heart of some of the things we're trying to do here with the DSPG program. So when you look at this little map, you can see that, you know, this is a low population county. It's not ultra large, but it's fairly, you know, 360 square miles. It has low unemployment. It has an annual budget of about 53 million, and it's predominantly white. And so when you talk to people about what do they envision when they think of rural America, this might be one of the places that they have in their head. Thanks, Sallie. Yeah. So the issue that came about and that that Sallie and her team really helped uncover was what do we do with reactive services? So reactive services, they're the things, you know, you can see in the second part, they're the things that when people call in and they need kind of immediate help. So it can be a breaking and entering, it can be domestic abuse, it can be animal control, these sort of things. And the city realized that the county, excuse me, realized that 61% of their total budget was being put into reactive services. Now that is an enormous part of any budget. And so it clearly brought up an issue that we need more information to understand what is at the core of this problem and how can we address it? How can we pinpoint where resources should go and what we can do? So in general, we know that reactive services are really crucial for maintaining public safety, for economic mobility, for developing these community assets, for quality of life. But there might be a better way for communities to proactively address the problems. And so they brought together a team with the local government, cooperative extension professionals, and community stakeholders, and they went through this data discovery process to say what reactive services are being utilized. And so you can see this whole list of things from the general district court to community service, Department of Social Services. And I just want to put a plug in. We're going to talk about this afternoon. Please come back. We're super excited about it. But not only are you asking people, how do you know where all the money's going? They're also uncovering like gold mines of data that you can use then to help them address their most pressing problems. So having these conversations about what are you measuring and what data do you possibly have really sheds light and spurs this discussion between all these really important stakeholders. I'm ready. So I love this map that is up here. And what this does is it shows you exactly where the reactive services were being used throughout the county. And it also shows you the amount of services that are being used. So the color tells you the type of service, the bar height tells you the amount of services that are being done. And what the finding was is that 1% of the locations utilized 25% of the services. 5% utilized 55% of the services and funding, and 10% utilized 71% of the funding. So this is really phenomenally useful information because suddenly you can say, well, if we know that 10% of the people are using the majority or 10% of the areas are using a majority of the services, now we have a really good idea of where we can pinpoint resources, education, intervention to go in and maybe make some positive change. And this is part of that data integration on the wheel. So we started with data discovery, we partnered, we found these results, that was the data integration. And then here is the action where you provide the data insight, you take it back and you say, what can we do? So the map identified these clusters where positive change could occur, and cooperative extension, you know, has really picked this up and is helping replicate this approach in another county. Actually, I should pause and say, Mike, do you want to say anything about this?
No, a good job. This was a pretty revealing, simple yet very revealing application of this.
Yeah, and that's what I love about this data science approach to communities is sometimes just this little bit of information can really drive big change. And this is a great example of how when that wheel keeps going. So to this measure and evaluate side about you share learnings that drive change, you keep evaluating what's happening. So this group started the focus on families utilizing services, and they really worked to create all sorts of leverage points where they could take this information, they could utilize it, they can make changes to programs and policies, and then these are the results of some of those changes that came about. So as a result of the policies that were put in place from this sort of data insight, there was a reduction in recidivism. There was a huge increase in the hours of community service. There were reductions in the TANF work program. We had more summer youth work program participants, enhanced pre-kindergarten education, and access to community college education. Now, I just want to pause for a minute and say, there is a benefit of not just taking a deficit perspective as well when you work with your communities. I know that our team has been talking about that a little bit, that when you take a deficit perspective, you tend to only measure negative things and you tend to report back on changing only negative things. But you can see from what was actually evaluated that what they did was also they leveraged what their strengths were and they grew those strengths. So they said, well, this is a problem and we can fix it, and this is a strength and we can expand it. And by both taking a deficit and kind of this positive approach to what their communities did well and leveraging those, they were able to make huge changes with just a few data insights. So it's a great example of what we're trying to do here.
Thank you, Cass. We can pause. Is there any question before we go to the next example? Going, gone? Does it look okay, Neil?
Yeah, I think there's no questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Okay, so this too is one of my favorite examples, and the analysis was pretty, just really imaginative as well as simple, but I can assure you a ton of data wrangling went into that, just in case you were wondering. So the next example that I want to share with you is a DSPG example from a couple years ago. And this is the Roanoke Valley Allegheny region in Virginia. And just again, a little bit of background on this region. It has, the region itself is several counties, and it has, you know, a little bit over 300,000 in population, over 2,000 square miles, has an unemployment rate that's pretty low. It has, so this annual budget is not right. It definitely is not just 52 million, that's a typo. But it has, again, from a race ethnicity standpoint, it's largely a white community. And this was where we started. So when the team met with the commission, the regional commission, to learn, you know, what's the issue that they wanted to study? What's the issue that they're grappling with? And what the issue had to do with was sort of the workforce, that they had jobs, and they also felt they had workers, but they didn't have workers coming to the jobs. And so they were grappling with what factors, you know, make an area attractive to workers and families. What could they do to make their area more attractive to workers and families? And again, they had a lot of jobs. So that was sort of where we started with engaging the community on what their issue in question was. So then the next step was to sort of take that issue and to try to see what we could learn about other communities that were grappling with that. And most importantly, not most importantly, but importantly, to place their question, to place this issue in a data context, something that we could try to bring data insights to. Well, to do that, we do something that we frequently do, is that we created what we call a data map. And we did this, the team actually created a version of this data map before they went in to their next engagement with the commission, with some of the leadership on the commission. And then together, they discussed it and refined it. And the data map basically is trying to take the problem, take that issue, and sort of characterize what the components are, what the components and topics and subjects and however you want to, whatever word you want to put to those, to the things on this picture. What are these components that are related to this problem? And the data map is going to be used to help guide where you might try to identify data sources that could measure these things, or could be surrogates to the measurement of these things. So there were internal labor force drivers, there were external labor force drivers when we discussed this problem, and much of this grew out of the literature that the team read. And both of those things come together and to create regional attractiveness. You know, what are the internal labor force drivers? There are challenges around the workforce. There's training that's needed for the workforce. And then on the external forces, there's just, you know, things that make an area attractive. Their parks, their walkability, housing affordability, the culture, education opportunities, and also transportation are issues. And then in the center here, this is really important because this kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of what are going to be some of the units of analysis that you're going to have to grapple with when you're putting data together. So you've got the region itself, and embedded in the region are cities and counties, and embedded in that there's households, and then the labor force comes out of the households, and then there's workforce development and industry that kind of overlaps these things. And if you start now to think about what potential data sources might exist somewhere in this map, Some of that data is going to be about individual people. Some of it's going to be about households. Some of it's going to be about neighborhoods. Some of it's going to be about the region. And so those are all different units of analysis that you do have to pay a lot of attention to when you're actually starting to statistically model the data. And also need to pay attention to it in terms of just how you characterize the problem. And this is going to come up a lot with your economic mobility indicators work, because we're talking about economic mobility as it relates to the community, but a community is made up of individuals. And so you're going to have data at all different units of analysis, and that's useful to keep track of that. So then the next step was to actually do formal data discovery. Now we sort of had a map of the sorts of things we might be looking for. Can we now start to attach data to that? And so we went through a data discovery process. I'm not going to talk too much about that because that's your subject this afternoon, and you'll see this picture reappear this afternoon. And so once the data discovery exercise was traveled through with the team returned to the commission and shared with them some of their findings. So this is just part of the data that they discovered and part of their data findings at this point, very descriptive, just giving them a data characterization of the region, things around high school graduation rates, employment, food insecurities, your parks, health data, just general population data, unemployment characteristics. And down here, you can see data sources. It's coming from a lot of different places. And so that's one piece of the data discovery and descriptive analysis. Then they also took a look at some GIS type data from maps, to do some mapping of access, to try to look at issues around transportation and how that related to different kinds of places of interest, like drug treatment centers and workforce development facilities. And one of the things that they found right away is that the bus stops and transportation access didn't align all that well with where there might be a preponderance of people who need such access. So that became very important. And sharing all of this back led to the next step, which was a discussion about what would actually be useful to the commission now that we have a sense of how to attach data to the data map. And in terms of really understanding this question about attractiveness and how they could match people with jobs, what would be useful for them? And so in that discussion, it was determined that creating some metrics, some what we call composite metrics that integrate other metrics, could be very useful to characterize the attractiveness component of the region. And so this was the result, and there's a lot that's behind this. This is just summarized here. So attractiveness indicators were created. Components of these indicators included things around transportation, things around housing, and things around the community. And you can see over here on the right, there was an index that was created that is how attractive is the region for singles. And then another one, how attractive is the region for families. And it's interesting to note that, you know, these are not the same, that it looks different whether you're a single person or whether you're a family. So this really provided great information for them to understand where would be the pockets of people that they would be trying to attract into these jobs that they have, and just in the future into their community as a whole. And from this, they actually took some policy actions. So here now we're on our ACT part of the cycle again. They did some changes to their transportation to develop better regional transit plans that met more of the demands that they felt they learned about in the process of taking a look at the data. They did some policy actions around housing, and then also actions around the community. There was a report that was created of these different actions. And although we haven't done it, so it gets back to the question that was asked earlier, you know, I would not be surprised if at some point they came back and asked us, you know, could we help them evaluate the impact of these policy actions? At which point it'll be really important that we're able to go back and be able to use and understand all of the data that was built into this project at the point that this project was done, and to figure out how do we roll that learning forward to be able to actually evaluate what the implications of their actions have been. So again, I will pause and see if there's any questions. Any thoughts? Mike or Cass, anything to add?
I think it's important to note that while you develop those composite indicators, you never necessarily started with that in mind. That came out of the process. And to acknowledge that, you know, the process sort of changes. You may go back a step and then go forward 2 or 3 steps. So it's not necessarily a straightforward, if we do A, then we do B, then we do C. You know, there's a lot of, there's an evolvement there that I think is exciting. And, you know, it can be a little bit messy, but again, that's sort of what's exciting about it as well.
Thank you, Mike. And it's also sometimes for junior researchers, what makes it scary. A lot of times you like to come into a problem, oh, here's the issue. Okay, I know exactly, I'm going to use this data and do this analysis. Yeah. And inevitably what you think of on day one is probably not going to be the right thing. That you have to let it evolve and kind of have the courage that it will evolve in a direction that is going to be fruitful.
It's real world.
Mm-hmm. If there aren't any more questions or comments at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Cass to give our last example.
Actually, I do have a question. I didn't know this was the actual end of the presentation.
No, it's not the end of the presentation. We have one more example, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Then I'll wait till the end.
Okay. Okay. Cass, back to you.
All right. So this one took place here in Iowa, and it was the pilot study for the Data Science for the Public Good project, the program that we've now initiated, and so many of us that are on the call today are all a part of. And this was in Marshalltown. So Marshalltown is a little bit bigger of a city than the Giles example that we gave, which was the county, but this has about 27,000 people. And when we were doing some assessments about, you know, what size of community do we want to be working with, we found this was sort of a sweet spot where we knew that they would have lots of data, but they still didn't necessarily have all of the resources that might be in a large city. One thing that was really interesting about Marshalltown was that you can see that the Hispanic population has doubled in size over the 10-year period from 2000 to 2010. And then it's continuing to grow. So one of the things that the city really needed help with, what they saw as one of their most pressing problems, was how can we update our transportation system? Our community is changing, our needs are changing, and our transportation system has not changed in a long time. And so they needed some data insights about where things could go. So what we know about these sort of communities and about transportation in general in these communities is local transportation is crucial to mobility, commerce, public safety, quality of life, community vitality. People were saying things like, I can't make it to the doctor. I can't get to the grocery store easily. And because many populations were quite poor, they didn't actually have their own vehicles to do this. So they were really reliant on the community transportation. So our goal going in was to better understand the community demographics, to better understand the transportation routes, and try to marry those things together to help give insights on how to move forward. So the findings, what you can see on the left side is this is one of the fabulous maps created by Chris Seeger, who is here. So shout out to Chris, excellent job here. And what he mapped here was the vulnerable populations in Marshalltown and their access to sidewalks. We also did their access to bus routes, to different things like that. So using the mapping techniques, we found which neighborhoods were in the greatest need. And you won't be surprised to say the people that had the greatest need and the least access were elderly and minority citizens in the community. So what we were able to do was take this then, so this is part of the data integration phase, and I guess I'm jumping to the next slide, where we actually get to act with this information.
Want me to move to the next one?
Yes, please. So we took this information to to the community and said, this is what we found. These are the pockets where people really need to have more access to transportation, and they're particularly vulnerable groups and they don't have it. And it was a fascinating and wonderful conversation, because this is all about partnership. And our city partners, you know, the people from the mayor's office and the leads over transportation said, yeah, we know everything you're saying, but what we appreciate is now we have data to back it up. You know, we drive through these communities and we know that this is a poor area and that there are no bus stops. But we really need to have this so we can take it to the city council, because they have to approve any change. Like if we want to add a bus stop, they're going to need to approve these sort of things. And so having the data in hand really empowered the city to go to the city council and say, these are the changes we made. And what was really phenomenal is that they did it. They made the changes, they took the action, and they were able to really move forward and make some significant progress. In addition, this kind of, you know, in terms of how this moves forward, once we shared this with the mayor's office and they shared it with the city council, then the city council reached back out and said, we love this and we would love to use this data to make other decisions. We have to make lots of decisions every day, and this would be really helpful to know all about the demographics of our city and where these pockets of people are that we might be able to provide services to. So in a follow-up, you can see a dashboard. Some additional funding was given from the AARP, and this was a dashboard that was added to Marshalltown from this early pilot work. So now community members and the city council could use this data in their own decision making. And one of the wonderful things that came out was the next slide that we got a little sneak peek at, which is this was an award-winning project. So by finding these areas where some of our most vulnerable citizens can now access transportation, it didn't just help vulnerable groups, but it upped the rates of transportation use overall in the city. And at the conclusion of the project, we had Kevin Pagors, he's on the left-hand side. He's the Municipal Transit Administrator and his team. They received the Federal Transit Award of Excellence and the Iowa Transit Authority Award of Excellence for the highest percentage increase in ridership among rural transit providers. And also, I'll pause, this isn't on the screen because we just got this news today, that this actually, so the National Association of Community Development and Extension Professionals is this national group. And you know, this was a project done, I've already mentioned Chris, he's an extension faculty member at our university. He made all of these gorgeous and beautiful maps. This project was submitted to NACDEP, you know, for consideration, and it won the North Central Regional winner, and it was the runner-up for the national winner, and got honors in the innovation and creativity, we found out today. So this project was award-winning kind of all the way around. The city really was able to move forward. Vulnerable citizens were able to do better. The city won awards for it. They were really reinforced for being able to use data science in their decision making. And the extension team that helped collaborate and lead so many of these efforts also won both regional and national awards for this work. So we're really proud of this job, and this seemed very, very simple in terms of the data science output, but had a really big impact, which again is the sort of thing we're working for here.
Congratulations, Cass.
Thank you, and Chris, who's on the call, way to go.
Oh, yeah, very good. So,
questions?
you know, so the bar now is quite high for project teams.
Yeah. So there's a question from Gina in chat that I would really love to take the first stab at, and then if that's all right. So Gina asks, she says, people are often averse to change. So how do policymakers help people who don't see the data and aren't necessarily involved in the process understand why certain actions are taken and how they'll improve the community? And I think this is just a really foundational question and issue, and something that we try to do. So one thing we'll talk about this afternoon is you really want to, when you're working with stakeholders, whether they're state government, local government, mayor's offices, you know, across these, we have so many different kinds of stakeholders that we work with. And many of the stakeholders we engage with are decision makers. And so when we're early in the process, one of the things we want to do is make sure that we engage them in forward-thinking visioning, where we say, what will you do when this is all over, and how will you act, and try and get people to commit to action early on. So part of my answer to you, Gina, is that we actually, part of this process is to help people think forward about, you know, at the end of this 10 weeks, you're gonna have data, and what are you gonna do with it? And really work through that process with them. What I found in my experience, and I know Sallie and Mike will have additional things to add here, is that if you can get people to commit to this idea of action early on. And most of the time we have partners who come to us and want our help, and so they are a little bit more flexible on this idea of data to action, but to really describe to them and explain to them and partner with them in understanding that this is not data for data's sake. We're not looking to run a data exercise. We're looking to help executive decision makers make executive decisions and to make informed decisions with data. And so that's part of our wheel. It's part of our process that people actually act on it. And so we really try to engage that and inform that at all the steps so that there isn't a disconnect between what we produce and how people act with it on the back end.
And
Sallie,
to amplify a little bit what Cass said, and also what we talked about on Monday, is that this is really about community-based research rather than research-based in the community. This is research where you're really hand in hand with the community stakeholders and trying to bring data insights to bear on their problem. And you're taking their time. Sometimes you are getting some of their own data, and there needs to be sort of a payback for that. They need to get something back out of that. And they're typically coming, as Cass said, because they already have a feeling that there's some changes that would perhaps be valuable for their community.
You know,
Joshua, go ahead. Mike, did you have a?
well, I was just going to say, it really is about partnerships and it's about collaboration. And, you know, one of the stellar points about cooperative extension is that we have pretty much units, we have staff, excuse me, in almost every county in the United States. And one of our strengths is our local collaboration with local governments. Our extension staff in those counties, they have very, very strong relationships with local government. And again, I think it's, you know, it's presenting it as Sallie said, you know, we're not here, we're here, we want to work on this together. And I think if you honestly come at it from that perspective, then, you know, there is more than a willingness for that locality to say, you know, yeah, let's do this together.
I want to jump on that, Mike. I was in a meeting last year, or a couple of years ago, I guess, that it just shook me and changed. I mean, it was a joke that was made, but it was fundamentally changed my approach, and it just really reinforced what Mike just said. And I was in a room that was almost entirely public servants. And so these were people across it was a national group, and there were people from across the US that worked for different mayors and governor's offices and state agencies. And there was a sprinkling, maybe 4 or 5 academics in the room. There just weren't very many. And someone made a joke, you know, the presenter said, oh, you know those academics, they're like Navy SEALs coming down from the ceiling and they know all the answers and they have all this high-tech stuff and they come in and they drop in and they tell you what they think is most important and then they go back up and you never see them again. And everyone like laughed for so long, like in a really sort of painful way, because it was like, wow, you all believe that deeply, that we just come in, we tell you something and we leave and we are out of there. And this process really tries to engage differently. It was one of the reasons that I loved this process when I heard about it the first time and thought, yeah, it really is about partnership at every level and making sure that we're not coming in like the Navy SEALs, dropping some specialized piece of information and going back up the ceiling like in, you know, the old movie. So we really are a partner all the way through.
That's great. That's a great example. So Joshua has a question. Is it realistic to assume county administrative data will be passed to us in real time for the summer projects? And that's a great question. Maybe. You're going to find that a ton of the data insights that you can develop will come from your imaginative and creative thinking and your data sleuthing as to where data might live and where data exists that could help support and bring some insights into the problem. We find, although we have in our own work on a 12-month basis, many data sharing agreements with different administrations, different administrative offices at the local, state, and federal level, that the vast majority of our work does end up to be bringing together data insights around open source data of different sorts. So that's part of the fun that you're going to have, and they're going to start talking about that this afternoon in data discovery. In some of the projects, we do expect that you'll be able to be using some local administrative data, and those agreements, like in the case of the Charlottesville Fire EMS, those agreements are already in place for that particular set of data, but you're going to be mashing that up. The only way that it's going to be really valuable data is if you mash it up with a lot of other things. That in and of itself will not answer the questions that you're setting out to achieve. So So it's going to be a mix of data sources of what you have. And for a lot of the communities we're working with this summer, this is the first time working with them. So, you know, by next summer, some of these communities, based on the work that you're doing this summer, will realize, wow, it's really valuable for me to think about some of my own administrative data and how I can bring that forward. So it'll be a mix. Then another question, and this, you know, has to do with the Marshalltown problem. Was the entire project complete? I think it's the Marshalltown project that's being
Yeah, I think so.
completed in the 10-week program. So Cass, you want to say a little bit more about the genesis of that project and what happened?
Yeah. So the quick answer is no, this did not get completed in a 10-week program. The first time that we're actually running this as a 10-week program is this summer, and the pilot went over a longer period. And we learned many things in our pilot. And one of them was that we needed to get the scope in place to do this within a 10-week program and not let scope creep happen where it just could get bigger and bigger. Another thing we learned that was really relevant to what we're doing today is we started the project with Marshalltown. Actually, Sallie and her team flew in, they helped us do the data discovery. It was this really wonderful process. And then not too long after, there was the tornado in Marshalltown. And the tornado came and, you know, they said, hold off, we are in crisis. Please do not come and do more analysis in our community for a while. You know, we're oversaturated. We have all of these federal agencies in, we have state agencies, you know, we're in disaster relief. Please step back. And so we recognized that communities in crisis need a little bit of spacing. And then we went back, and this was probably like 6 months after, you know, our false start. Oh, and one other thing is the transit authority director died. And so we kind of had our main point of contact, and then the city was in crisis, and we just thought, wow, this project, what is going to happen here? Highs and lows for sure. So we went back and we met again with the mayor's office, and we said, all right, the entire landscape has changed. Let's ask you the first question we asked you, what is your most pressing problem? And we assumed that it would not be transportation anymore. And they said, no, transportation is more important than we realized before, we need to do it. And so the team came together and we facilitated, you know, really Chris and some of his colleagues in the cooperative extension did some phenomenal work in mapping and doing the GIS work that was foundational to this project. And that took several months to do, but also because it wasn't a team of students who gave their dedicated time and had faculty over the short and intensive weeks. But then just like that wheel, you know, the project was over, and then the AARP came and gave money to add that bit to the website. And then, you know, the awards came for the federal transit and the state transit authority. And then the awards came for the community extension. So some of the things we're describing just take time to uncover. But the process and the project itself, even though we had this long false start, it didn't take an exceptionally long time, but it wasn't 10 weeks. But we also didn't have a 10-week team. And so when Chris and I were done, we wrote up like a report of what we learned. And one of our #1 things was scope matters, and communities in crisis need gentle touches. And so as we're in COVID and we're thinking about communities in crisis, I would strongly recommend that as you are reaching out to these people, you know, be cool, like know what's going on, be aware of the situation, and be gentle, because people might come into it and have so many other things going on in their lives right now.
Thank you, Cass. It looks like we're at the witching hour. There's one more, Chris. Chris, you want to say something? Oh.
He's saying there were like a million crazy things that happened on that project. We just told you the big ones.
So I think we are at our time. I hope this has been helpful, and you will all get to sort of engage in the wheel as we move forward. And I look forward to seeing you guys this afternoon for data discovery.